So we got big shoes to fill. Andrew Jackson. That's Andrew Johnson. Andrew Jackson was a much better president. Andrew Johnson. That's him in his first senatorial position. Speaking of Andrew Jackson, there is an apocryphal myth that he was named after Andrew Jackson. Both Tennessee politicians. Probably not true because of the timeline, but he did have a big man crush, I believe is the historical term, on Andrew Jackson. They both consider themselves men of the people. He was what's called a mudsill, which is the 18th century equivalent, or the 1800s equivalent of white trash. The only thing that he was above in the world was slaves, and that's, you'll see as we go on, a big theme in his whole life is spiting rich people, which I guess I can agree with. So early life, he was born in poverty in Raleigh. One of 3 children in the Mudsill family, 2 brothers and the youngest daughter. Dad dies at the age of 4. He's sent at the age of 14 to be an apprentice with his brother as a tailor. Apparently didn't go very well, although that's where he got most of his book learned, as he would say. They would have had local community members, doctors, attorneys, come and read to the apprentices while they worked. It's actually pretty common this day in factories. You can see, like, if you go to semi-industrialized parts of the world, they'll hire a reader to read the paper to them while they all work in a factory. So it's probably not the best situation, but he would read that. He would borrow books from a local doctor with whom he was friends with, his mentor. And he would read 2 to 3 hours a night, which doesn't sound very impressive, but when you're reading by kerosene, a little more impressive than it is today. But eventually, he must have been mistreated because he escaped with his brother. He ran to Tennessee, and very much in the same way you would put out a wanted poster for a runaway slave, the tailor put out a reward poster for him, $10 for his capture. And that kind of, they believe that this is what started him on his path of resentment towards anybody of any means, even though later in life he came about some means himself. That's backwards. Involvement in local politics. He eventually settles in Greenville. He was, while in Raleigh, he tried to, he fell in love with a local merchant's daughter, made her a quilt because he was a tailor, and you know, nothing makes the ladies swoon like a quilt. Unfortunately, her family had a bit of wealth. He didn't. He was a mudsill, so the parents came in and broke that up. But he did eventually marry Elizabeth McCradle. She was a daughter of a shoemaker. Being on the same level as a tailor, there wasn't that class warfare, so he married Eliza. With him to the day he died, although she never went to Washington with him, the family stayed in Tennessee, even through the Civil War, because she was sickly for most of her life. As a tailor, he thrived in business. That picture I just showed back here, that is a house he actually purchased when he had some money. Oh, and we're throwing stuff. Oh, we're going to edit all this out. No, we're not, because Freemasonry. But this is a house he purchased for his growing family. While he was in this home, he actually bought the first of 6 slaves that he would own. He was a slave owner. 6 slaves not by the end of his life, by the end of slavery. All house slaves. He never really owned any farmland of means. He did buy a farm to put his mother and stepfather on, but it wasn't a plantation. In fact, he had a seething hatred for that planter class. But his shop did become a gathering place for local, what were called mechanics, politicians. A mechanic was anybody who worked with their hands. We have auto mechanics now, but back then it was tailors, coopers, anybody who worked for a living. He would walk to the local university, 6 miles each way, to go to a local orators club, the equivalent of the Toastmasters back then, to work on his oratory to better himself. His oratory was explained as blunt and unrelenting. He wasn't a Thaddeus Stevens. He wasn't even a Lincoln. He was a good old country boy who knew what he knew, and he would hammer it in until basically you relented out of sheer exhaustion. He very much saw the world in good and evil, black and white, literally black and white. He was elected to the state legislature, and he constantly voted with those values. He didn't vote with the party. He voted against any kind of railroad expansions, thinking that it would take innkeepers out of business. He voted for. He very much voted for more and more slave codes, because he believed any kind of freedom granted to, or any semblance of freedom granted to a slave would undercut the price of a working man, which is something we'll see as he goes on. In national politics, 43 to 53 is in Congress. Anti-abolition, because a freedman, just like we see throughout history, a freedman or an Irishman or anybody that's going to come over and willing to work for less is bad for the lower class working man, so we can't have that. Fiscal conservative, he actually voted against the Smithsonian, thought it was a waste of money. Although he didn't like people because, well, he was kind of objectively not a nice person. So he would spend his time scrolled away in the Library of Congress reading books and furthering his education, but he voted against the Smithsonian, a public institution of higher learning, which seems a little silly to me. He was governor from 53 to 57. Very, very little power. It was a Whig legislature, and the way that the state government was structured, they basically had the power to shoot down anything that he proposed. Senator in 57 to 62. He tried one of his main claims to fame was a Homestead Act. He thought a way to lift up these mud sills was to send them west, give them 40 acres. Everybody's familiar with basically the Homestead Act was, we're going to take all this land out west that nobody's living on except for Native Americans because they aren't using it right, and we're going to give 40 acres to a man and a wife that are basically under a certain income. After so many years, it would be theirs. He didn't get it done in the Senate. He did get it done when he was president. Vocal anti-secessionist, which kind of put him at odds with literally everybody in Tennessee. He viewed that very much in the term of Andrew Jackson was the Union is the Union and it can't be broken, flat stop, period. But he was still, at this point, he expressed anti-abolitionist views. And he kind of looks like Tommy Lee Jones at this time in his life. Wartime governor, because of these pro-union stances, he was appointed the wartime governor of Tennessee by Lincoln. By 62, Grant chased the rebels out of most of eastern Tennessee, cleared Nashville, and eastern Tennessee would stay rebel-free for the rest of the war. The West, because of the geography of it, it's very inhospitable to people who don't know the territory. So it took a little while to clean out western Tennessee, but he was appointed governor with the rank of brigadier general. This is when he starts to express some abolitionist views. He was cornered on the steps of a courthouse by some local freedmen saying, thank you for chasing the masters away. Thank you, Governor Johnson. And he kind of got caught up in it and called himself Moses of the Negroes. This won't be the last time that he will compare himself to a biblical figure. But the man had a pretty high opinion of himself. Funny, though, is because Tennessee had him as a wartime governor, they weren't considered enemy territory for the purposes of the Emancipation Proclamation. So Tennessee was the only Confederate state to vote slavery out. Because they were not enemy occupied, there was a referendum led by Johnson in which slavery was, they voted down the institution of slavery in Tennessee. On paper, the people who were part of that wartime government anyways. We'll see in a little bit when we talk about Reconstruction, how there wasn't a lot of apologies for the acts committed during the Civil War, or certainly before the Civil War in the South. Lincoln was looking for a Southern Democrat with some military experience. Wasn't many of those in the Union at that point, so he finds Johnson. His current governor his current vice president was a man named Hannibal Harris, a strong abolitionist Mainer. But Maine doesn't get many votes. It's Maine. Even back then, it was Maine. So Lincoln wanted somebody to get those border states. Lincoln takes the nomination easily, but I tried to find a narration of it. This would have been our intro video if I could find it, but I could not. He supposedly was feeling ill in the days leading up to it, and treated that illness with a whole bunch of whiskey, which led to a 45-minute rambling inaugural speech in the Senate chambers. Lincoln was sworn in outside. He was sworn on the inside. Among the highlights is he forgot the name of the Secretary of War. So his speech included, and I've forgotten the name of the Secretary of War. So not one of the strongest orators in the history of the Union. Not much better when he's drunk. The only defense that Abe had for him was, I know Andy, and Andy's no drunkard. And we'll see that probably wasn't true as we move on. April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinates Lincoln. What is lesser known, it was a powerful lodge conspiracy. This gentleman was sent to kill Johnson, but luckily he gets drunk in the lobby of the hotel and wanders off. He got cold feet. Lewis Powell did a little bit better. He breaks into the Secretary of State's mansion. His gun jams, so he uses it to beat the fear of God, we'll say, into one of Stuart's sons, and then he goes to shoot him, but because he used the gun as a club, it jammed, so he abides himself with slashing and stabbing at the Secretary of State who was in his sickbed. He lived, had a permanent facial paralysis on the left side of his face for the rest of his life, but he survived, so 1 out of 3 ain't bad, I guess. Shortly after Lincoln was shot, Johnson was brought to his attention at his hotel. He immediately, like all prudent, almost assassinated gentlemen would do, puts his clothes on and goes down to the home in which Lincoln is dying to visit his friend. Only stayed for about 30 minutes because Mary Todd didn't like him. Granted, Mary Todd didn't like many people. If I would encourage anybody to look up the mental health issues of First Lady Todd, or First Lady Lincoln. But she, not a big fan of him. So he stayed for 30 minutes and left, got hourly updates, and Lincoln passed away later that day. His domestic policies, I don't have a slide for him because they're not good. We'll get into more of them. We'll get into them deeper in the Reconstruction slides. But he basically, his whole policy was to allow the South in back in the Union as easily as possible. He had the same view as Lincoln that we can't punish them because they didn't secede, because secession wasn't a thing a state could do. They were just unruly members of the Union, but there was never a confederacy because there couldn't be a confederacy because you can't leave the United States. So that made it difficult to use any of the punishments the radical Republicans wanted. Congress is made mostly radical Republicans, so there was that impasse. Aside from that, the homestead stuff, he basically vetoed everything that Congress put out, and Congress overrode those vetoes. Pretty much back and forth for his 4 years. It got so bad, he's like, I don't know what I'll do. I'll go to the people. The people will understand me. So from August 27th to September 15th, 1866, he toured the country. He called it his swing around the circle, and he dragged poor Ulysses S. Grant with him. Another great historical drunk who one day became president. Remember how I said that these are my views and not the views of my aggressive opponent in the Masonic body? Also the views of most historians. The problem was he gave the same speech time after time after time, and this being the age of the telegraph, it got ahead of him. So it would be published in the paper before he got there, and him being not so popular would get mercilessly heckled, which led to him drinking and starting fights. And Grant, you see Grant's letters back to his wife going, he's embarrassing us, he's embarrassing the Union. And remember how I said that would be the last time he compared himself to a biblical figure? He started comparing himself to Christ on the cross in 1866 in the Deep South. I am not a professional politician, but I would not compare myself to Christ on the cross in the least religious portion of the least religious part of this country. Not a good political move, but he had very high opinions of himself and a weakness for the creature. Impeachment. When you start getting an adversarial position with your Senate and your congressmen, when you start comparing yourself to Christ in public venues, probably going to get impeached. It was because of he fired Andrew McMaster's, because McMaster's is a very strong radical Republican Reconstructionist, wanted to punish the South, as most military men did. We're not going to go into Grant very deeply, but Grant becomes the president after him, and Grant, seeing the ravages of the Civil War, had a pretty poor view of the planter class and the Confederate States of ways, because that just went down. Good job, Internet, so I can cuss. So if we dropped out for a little bit, Grant was not the biggest friend in the whole wide world of Mr. Johnson. We heard in the intro video that Johnson retired in the Senate, and that he didn't go much further because he died. All of his time in Washington, Johnson's family stayed away. They stayed in Tennessee. They stayed in Nashville. You kind of don't have to wonder why when he couldn't even get along with his own cabinet. And this is a reconstruction of a ticket for the impeachment trials. They sold tickets because in the land before the internet, they had to make their own entertainment. And the 11-week trial, I guess it must have been pretty entertaining. Johnson as the Mason, as we can see, he was a Templar. Raised in 1851, Greenville Laws number 119. It's now number 3 in, believe it or not, Greenville, Tennessee. By 51, probably a member of Greenville chapter because he joined the Templary in 59. We see his uniform here. He received the Scottish Rite degrees while he was in the White House in 1867, so I guess he did something while he was in the White House worth talking about. As a personal note, notice how he doesn't have a chapeau on. Those of you in the audience who are Templars know what I'm talking about. Those who aren't, current Knights Templars wear a Civil War naval hat called the chapeau. This was right after the Civil War, and he did not feel the need to wear that silly hat. So, hashtag go team cap and mantle. So now we're into Reconstruction. This is Lincoln's plan. His proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction didn't run it past Congress, which got him some trouble, because as we learned, Congress really wanted to punish the South. Those radical Republicans. His basic idea was, once 10% of the voting population in 1860 takes the oath of loyalty to the established government, makes a new constitution, then you're back in the Union. The issue with 1860 is who weren't citizens in 1860, who might have a vested interest in the creation of a Southern government. The French, yes, it was the French.
I don't know, what are you talking about?
The slaves. So in all these Reconstruction plans, there was really no consideration given to giving any black Americans the vote. Because why rock the boat, right? They gave them their freedom whether they want to vote too. We'll get to that in a little bit. It pardoned all but the highest ranking Confederate military and civilians. Basically anybody under the rank of captain of the Navy, anybody under the rank of colonel in the Army could go free. They kept their sidearm, they kept their horse, they kept the uniform. Because for a lot of these junior members of the armed forces, that was all the clothes they owned. Unless you were a judge or a politician who left the Union to join the Confederacy, you get off scot-free too. And even then, we'll see Johnson does something even weaker than this. He drops to 10% and pretty much goes with, you want to join? You want to join? You want to come back? Okay, cool. It was a reasonable proportion, was his words, which in some counties was 1%. They found one guy to go, yeah, I guess I renounce the Confederacy, but we'll see in some of these governments that are built up. He was probably lying. The radical Republicans, led by Mr. Thaddeus Stevens, who actually is Tommy Lee Jones, he did not have, to the best of my research, a black live-in mistress. There's a lot of things that are historically incorrect about that Daniel Day-Lewis movie. It's not a bad film, but it kind of takes some concessions with history. Not nearly as much as, say, Braveheart, but it takes some concessions. Basically, the majority of the congressional Republicans wanted to whoop the Tower of the South. They saw at these massive death tolls, these riots and unrest that happened from the Civil War, and they just wanted to make sure that nobody had the gall to leave the Union ever again. They believed that you had the right to leave the Union and could be punished for it. Lincoln and Johnson, they don't believe that you had the right to leave, so you really can't be punished. Their main drive was black suffrage, freedmen's programs, full and equal rights to black Americans. Not necessarily a popular view, even with the men on the ground. It varies state to state. Massachusetts, for one, you'd think, live in modern-day Massachusetts, there would be fairness proposal. Very, very dim view of it as a state that was already getting an influx of immigrants. The national-born Americans, Bill the Butcher from gangs in New York, these know-nothing parties, already had this deep-seated fear of the immigrant. They didn't need freedmen coming up to the north and taking their jobs too. The western states are probably the most amenable to it because there was just so much land. They really couldn't see much of an issue with it. Although a lot of the West was settled by ex-Confederates, so they may have had an issue with it on a person-to-person basis. The Wade-Davis bill was probably one of the stronger of the radical Republican views. That's Wade, that's Davis. Required 50% of the voters to take an ironclad oath that they never, ever voluntarily join the rebellion. In some states, that could just never happen. Absolutely, positively not. Could never happen. It was basically designed. What it would have turned into was a government mostly of freed slaves, because those were probably the only people that could say they never had any interest in the Confederacy. Even liberal Republicans knew that wouldn't fly in the South. We were going to have enough issues that couldn't fly. The Wade-Davis bill was vetoed by Johnson. It became the Wade-Davis Manifesto, and it was kind of this touchstone going forward of the epitome of Southern punishment. It required a state convention, but ratified the 14th Amendment. That was the main crux of these specific safeguards. Lots of money to freedmen's schools, Freedmen's Bank, Freedmen's Bureau. Basically, as a refresher, 13th Amendment frees the slaves, 14th Amendment makes them citizens, 15th Amendment gives them the right to vote. So this was the gold standard of reintegration. We'll get to the Freedmen's Bureau, I think, on the next slide. Yeah, we will. Freedmen's Bureaus, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands. Basically, all these planters, all these traders to the Union, they weren't using these big farms anymore. But you know who's familiar with them and who could work them? The people that had to work them for free for the last 6 generations. So one of the main drives of it was to break up these large parcels of land and give them to these freed slaves, create schools that did everything from citizenship classes to train them up to be local officials. They leased and rented tools. They made schools and built churches. They were seen as carpetbaggers by the South. These Northerners who came down and are messing with our way of life, very much the same way that the Freedom Riders were seen in the 60s. And you'll see a lot of parallels between these 2 points in history. In fact, a lot of historians would view the civil rights movement as the Second Reconstruction, how they punched back against Jim Crow rather than the slave planters. This is a picture from the Frank Leslie's Illustrated, showing that basically their view was, they're giving all these benefits and land and money to these freedmen. So they can just sit there and pick away on the banjo and never work, while us poor white folk are sitting there working our fingers to the bone. The reality of it was most of these black farmers became sharecroppers, working the same lands that they worked, the same land that they worked for before the war. A sharecropper is basically you don't make any money, you rent the seed and tools and the land from the owner, and you get a third to a half of the crops as payment at the end of the season. Unfortunately, as we'll see in a few slides, more often than not, the ex-master would chase them off the lands, would kill one of them when they asked for their payment. So it was still de facto slavery. Are we frozen? Yes, we are. There we are. One of I think the coolest but most doomed aspects of these Freedmen Acts was the Freedmen's Bank. Basically, because these ex-slaves, they didn't have any credit. They owned nothing for collateral. They had no money to lend for a bank to lend them money. So they couldn't buy land. They were stuck in this sharecropper existence. So the government from 65 to 74 created these banks, especially to grant loans to black veterans and ex-slaves. 19 branches in 12 states, mostly in the South. Unfortunately, as the government progressed and the North got tired of Reconstruction, less and less money was given to fund these banks, and they eventually folded. When they folded, the last chairman of the bank was Frederick Douglass. I recommend anybody go and buy or get his orations from the library. Probably one of the greatest orators of any time, certainly on par with Lincoln. Also didn't like Andrew Johnson. When Andrew Johnson was at his drunk stupor at the inauguration, he glared across the room at Douglass, and Douglass wrote in his journal that man had pure hate in his eyes. Johnson was never, ever, ever pro-Black America. He was a white supremacist. Flat stop, period. The only reason he believed in abolition was to get back at those rich planters who snubbed him. This is why he may be considered one of the worst presidents in history. Certainly one of the most petty presidents in history. That he would go so far as to freeing the slaves is one thing, as it gets back at those people who made fun of me when I was poor. But if we give them rights, and we give them freedmen's bureaus, and we treat them as people, then what's the world going to become? They're going to take our jobs. Which, unfortunately, is a narration that we see continued throughout history. The Reconstruction Acts in 1967 basically establishes 5 military districts in the South. You want to be a state again? You want to get rid of your military governor? Ratify the 14th Amendment, vetoed by Johnson because the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to African Americans, and we can't have them getting that because it undercuts this view of that Southern Mudsill pride. Overturned by Congress, which this is also one of the large touchstones that probably led to the impeachment, along with the firing of Stanton, probably the slapping down of the Reconstruction Acts. But it's okay, because the South saw the Reconstruction Act, saw the Freedmen Bureaus, and went, in that case, we're going to mix these black codes. We're going to take our slave codes, replace the word slave with Negro, and just keep going. It prevented freedmen from bearing witness, serving in juries, owning firearms, doing any work besides farming, being out past night, walking on the sidewalk in some municipalities. And the punishment for some of these was, in Georgia, you could beat a man to death for not obeying the black codes. After slavery, freedmen didn't get off the sidewalk that you were walking on. You were allowed to beat him to death. This was the so-called freedom that these poor men and women were born into. Lincoln the Emancipator, and then we have Johnson, who allowed this to happen in the South, this to happen to the experiment that was Reconstruction. A lot of this is because of slaughterhouse ruling, because the attorney is going to get at least one court case into his presentation. Basically, there's a New Orleans law that said, we don't want dead cow bits in our drinking water. It's not healthy. There was a cholera outbreak. Not good for the city that was already ravaged by the war. Anyone who slaughters their farm animals has to go 1.5 miles from the city, out of the watershed, go kill your cows down there. And these factory owners, they sued. They went, wait, you're violating my rights under the 14th Amendment. You're violating my equal protection under the law, which is the first of what we continue to see, a perversion of this law from, all sorts of things that I can't mention without getting political, have used the 14th Amendment. The majority of cases that go before the Supreme Court, constitutional cases, are by far 14th Amendment rights, 14th Amendment cases. But what the court said was, except for a few federal guarantees, travel between the states, interstate commerce, navigable waterways and rivers, that's what the 14th Amendment, that's what your equal protection is. Pretty much everything else is up to the states, which is why if you ever read a legal opinion, you'll see people jump through hoops to see that they can somehow tie these cases to interstate commerce, and some more effective than others. But in a lot of cases, in the say during the Civil Rights era, that's how hotels and public accommodations got integrated, is because a hotel is near a highway is a place of interstate commerce. You shut down hotels, it affects interstate commerce. So as you see a more sympathetic Supreme Court, they kind of widen a little bit, but it's never quite been overturned. What this means is what's not a interstate travel is the right to vote, the right to marry who you want, the right not to get beaten to death for not getting off the sidewalk. So this slaughterhouse rule is probably one of the most important cases in U.S. history, certainly civil rights-wise.
So is that the law that the modern-day sovereign citizens always refer to?
Modern-day sovereign citizens are crazy people. They do not refer to laws.
No, they always refer to it's on the U.S. because I can do interstate commerce and travel, and that's exactly what we're saying there.
It's the internet is a beautiful thing.
I'm not saying they're right, by the way.
I've seen.
I'm wondering if that's just the.
It's certainly an argument. It's not the right argument, but they also say that 2/3 of the states didn't ratify the acts empowering the IRS, which isn't true. They're crazy people. I apologize to any free staters out there, but please, for the love of God, watch some Schoolhouse Rock. On that glib note, to something that is certainly not a laughing matter is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, when there's a president that would do absolutely nothing to protect these freedmen. You get scenes like this. You get scenes like of this mass lynching. One of the few solaces that I have in life is every single one of these people walking around is rotting in hell right now. There's a special place in hell reserved for all these men. But it's the reality of history. Men were castrated. Pregnant women had babies ripped out of them as a picnic event. People would go down. They would go and they would hang some southern trees, bear strange fruit. They would hang a couple people and have a picnic and take pictures. And this is back in the era where photographs weren't necessarily cheap. So they had so much pride in this, they printed postcards of lynchings. Once again, this is these grand acts of reconstruction, this promise to uplift these freedmen, to bring them a seat at the table, and this is what they got, arguably till the modern day. We have thanks to Brother Steve, we have two primary sources. It wasn't just freed slaves who were the targets of the Klan, although they were a favorite target. It's pretty much anybody who wasn't a member of the Klan. I'll Republicans, the so-called carpetbaggers in the Freedmen Bureau. Here we have 2 senators who were assassinated by the Klan out of a newspaper. We have 2 members of the government who stepped down and left the state because the Klan told them to. The Klan was the police. It was the National Guard. It was in the rural South. It was Christ on the cross. It was more powerful than the federal government could ever be. It was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, between December and August by 6 former Confederate officers. One of the early members was a Mason, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and a lot of people who enjoy what he did as a military man. A lot of people who feel the need to not look history in the eye will say, well, it was a veterans fraternal organization. It was like a VFW. They really didn't want to terrorize and murder black people. That's absolutely false. Like, almost immediately they started doing terror rides through the countryside with torches and sacks on their heads. Some of which wearing horns as though they were the devil, to terrorize these poor sharecroppers. And within the first year, they were lynching people. They were stringing people up. So to say that that is a fraternal organization, we're all members of a fraternal organization, that's disrespectful to history, and it's disrespectful to the intelligence of any thinking man. We have no idea how many people died in the first few years of Reconstruction. People guess between 500 and 2,000, we think. It's truly impossible to prove. That's history, and that's what happens when we pulled out of the South and the Army left. Part of the reason the Army left was working on it. Is frozen as part of the reason why the Army left. Well, before we get to that, we'll get to the Colfax Massacre. There was a contested gubernatorial election in 1872 in Louisiana. The ex-Confederate Democrats elected a member to Congress, elected a governor, as did the Freedmen and the Republican Party. Easter Sunday, 1873, they had their convention to formally nominate them. A group of ex-Confederate Democrats with rifles and cannons marched down the street and proceeded to open fire on the courthouse. In the melee that happened, they murdered 100 freedmen. Many of the people in the delegation were freedmen, as was the militia who was protecting it. But they didn't come to face down cannons. 100 were slaughtered in the battle, if it could be called a battle. Then, hours after surrendering, they executed another 50. This led to the U.S. case of United States versus Crookshanks, which pretty much okayed it. Pretty much said that the government really couldn't punish them. It was more of a states matter to deal with things of this nature. It wasn't within the broad scope of those federal powers to come down on what was seen as a states issue. We have here an etching from the paper of just folks recovering their dead. What didn't kill the Klan, but what drove it underground was the 1871 Klan Acts signed by President Grant. Pretty much allowed the government to suspend habeas corpus and just hunt the cowards down. Go in and very loose judicial outline to go and break up these Klan meetings and basically treat them as the terrorists that they are. It would be driven underground. The Klan never dies, but it would be driven underground until around 1910, when we see a resurgence of the Klan. We start seeing the transformation of these black codes into Jim Crow laws. But Grant, like I said, wasn't nearly as strong on the Rebel South as he could have been, but at least he smashed the Klan, something that Johnson refused to do. When did it end? It didn't end positively, no matter what. Some people believe it was the redemption governments of 73. That was basically a clean sweep of the southern states by ex-Confederates. Congressman Alexander H. Stevens was the vice president of the Confederate States of America and was elected congressman for the 8th District of Georgia. You could go into some areas of the South, some states, and the people in the governor's mansion and the courts were literally the same people who were there before the war. The Reconstruction had failed. The African Americans and Republicans were pushed to the wayside, and the Dixiecrats had taken back the reins of government. A lot of this was because of the Compromise of 77, where in order to elect Hayes, we remove all troops from the South, declare Reconstruction over. They appoint a Southern Democrat to the Hayes administration, the Postmaster General, a fairly prominent and powerful position back then, considering how he who controls the mail controls everything. It sends funds to industrialize the South, including the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which the reason, if you look at pictures, how it dips down through the South unnecessarily, down through Texas, is because of this compromise. And there's an agreement for basically leave the issues of the freed slaves and the black men to us. It's a states' rights issue. In quotations, we'll take care of it. So this is Hayes literally turning his back on millions of Americans. Hayes also not looked on fondly as a president. And there is an argument that Reconstruction never ended because we never achieved that equality in the South. They're still fighting for it in the 1960s, still fighting for it now. So it's hard to kind of put a pin on when it ended because it may never have ended. Masonry during the late war and Reconstruction. Thank you to Brother Steve from Union Lodge for this. I'm sorry, Union Lodge number 4. We have to get the numbers in there. The Hayden Lodge number 8 in Charleston was chartered by the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts in 1865. It was the second Prince Hall Lodge chartered after the war, beat by Union Lodge number 1 a month earlier, but that was founded by the National Grand Lodge, so I would believe that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge says that they still win. Amongst the signers, the creators of this new constitution for South Carolina was Brother Albert Mackey, which I believe most Masons are familiar with, as long as members of Hayden Lodge number 8, Drayton Lodge number 4, and Shekinah Lodge number 5, all Prince Hall lodges. So we see when Grant was in office, when the Radical Republicans in Congress got their way, you see these Prince Hall Masons, who are probably leaders of the community, taking an active role as active Americans, in complete contrast to what we saw a few slides ago of sitting on a porch playing banjo, not really giving much of a care of their nation. And we have the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of South Carolina, founded in 1869, so very, very quickly after the Civil War, during construction, they formed this Grand Lodge. We have some selected readings. The Loyalist, with a capital I where it shouldn't be. It's the one book I bought that I didn't get out of the library. You're free. Anybody who wants to, feel free to take it home. It's written okay. It's written by a physician who tries fairly well to redeem something in Johnson. He doesn't shy away from the fact that he was a white supremacist, but he makes a shot at redemption. I'm not entirely convinced, but it's a quick read. Impeachment, The Trials of Andrew Johnson, The Fight for His Legacy by David O. Stewart. He is a professional historian, and this is probably the book on the impeachment. A a little dry, but it's impeachment in general is a dry subject. And the Wars of Reconstruction, it's the gold standard of anybody who takes a Civil War class is going to read this book by Egerton. It's the nitty-gritty, punch-for-punch details of Reconstruction and the horrors of that time. Next month, we're going to do a full 180. We're going to go into the unlikely foundations of Masonry, the old gods. We're going to talk a little bit about these ancient religions, about Norse mythology and Egyptian mythology, and how Masonry lifted some of these concepts to incorporate into our degrees. With that, any questions, comments, death threats? Anybody?
Well, presentation.
I'll see everybody in November.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, Jason.
And we're frozen again.